All right. I think we've given everyone a chance to connect and settle in now. So how about we get started? First of all, hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar, everyone. We are very happy to see such large participation. Welcome to the U.S. Embassy in Sweden's webinar on the student visa application process. My name is Martin. I work for the commercial department of the embassy, and today I have with me my colleague Beatrice, who also works with me at the commercial department, as well as Holly and Adam of the embassy's consular section, who will be presenting to you today. So the webinar today will be comprised of a presentation held by Holly and Adam of around 20 minutes, and will be followed by a Q&A session, bringing us back to the top of the hour at 4. But before we get started, I quickly wanted to mention a few housekeeping rules to consider throughout this webinar. And the first is, as you may already have noticed, that all participants for this webinar have been muted. So to ask questions for the Q&A portion of the webinar, we kindly ask that you write your questions in the chat. That way we can address the questions in the order that they come in. And when it comes to asking questions in the Q&A, we kindly ask that your questions be as general as possible, as we will be unable to address questions that are on a case-specific level. Now, we will, of course, try to answer as many questions as time will allow. So with that said, I will now hand it over to Holly and Adam.
Thank you, Martin. So I'm Holly, and this is my colleague Adam. We work at the consular section at the U.S. Embassy in Stockholm. And I am going to start sharing my screen with you. Okay, so welcome to U.S. Embassy Stockholm's Student and Exchange Visa webinar. First things first, I want to start with a couple of key takeaways so that if you don't remember anything else from this presentation, you can at least remember these few things. So the very first thing is apply early. So as soon as you get all of your documents together, apply for your visa. Sometimes it takes longer than you think it's going to. So just as soon as you're ready, get on our website, set up your appointment, and apply for your visa. Number 2, travel to the US. So we've had some changes to our interview waiver requirements, and that means now that anyone who has traveled to the US, either on ESTA or has had a previous visa before, or is planning a trip to the US before they apply for their visa, can now possibly qualify for an interview waiver. And that means that you don't have to come to the embassy and have an interview. You can just mail us all of your materials and have your visa adjudicated that way. So that's something that I'm going to talk about in more detail during the webinar, but that's an important point, so keep that in mind. Travel to the US. Number 3, so submit all the required application materials. So you'd be surprised how many people send us incomplete applications. The steps on the website are fairly clear, and I'm also going to go through all of the required documents during the presentation. So just when you're submitting your application, make sure that you've got everything. And finally, number 4, I know that today is the last day of COVID in Sweden, but there are still some COVID entry requirements for the United States, so I'll go through those briefly as well. Okay, so what is this presentation going to cover? The first thing is the types of student visas, then what do you need to apply? Like I said, interview waiver application. So do you actually need to come in and have an interview, or can you just mail in your materials to us? I'll cover all of the requirements for that. And then finally, we hope to have time for your questions. Okay, so the first thing that I'll talk about is just the steps to apply for a student visa. So step 1, you're going to get your official form in the mail. So if you're applying for a J visa, that's going to be a DS 2019. If you're applying for an F or an M, that's an I-20. So that's a form that your school will send to you once you've been accepted and everything. Step 2, you're going to go online and pay your Student and Exchange Visitor Information System fee. So the website is right there, but you basically go online and you'll pay that fee. That's step number 2. Step number 3, you'll go to the State Department website and you'll go ahead and fill out your DS-160. That is your visa application form. So you'll fill that out, submit it online, you'll pay the fee. All that is step 3. Step number 4, after you pay the fee, if you do need to come in for an interview, that's at the point where you will schedule your interview. But like I said, a lot of you might be eligible to mail in your application instead. So that's the step at which you would mail us all of your materials. And then Step 5, that would be when you come in for your interview or when we receive your application materials, and you're going to mail us everything that we need. So your official forms, your DS-160 confirmation page, your passport, your photo, and your visa application fee receipt. And don't worry, you don't need to remember all of that. I'll go through all this in a little bit more detail as we go through the presentation. And then step 6 is just when you come in for your interview. If you come in for an interview, you'll talk to the consular officer. They'll adjudicate your case. Otherwise, like I said, with the mail-in, we'll have all of your materials and we'll make a decision then. That's step 6. Adam?
One very important part we should mention is when you schedule your interview, you're going to answer a couple of questions that's going to determine if you're eligible to actually send in your material. Before you send in your material, make sure you have a confirmation page stating that you are supposed to mail in your documents. Do not send in your documents without having the confirmation page for your interview waiver. More about that a little bit later.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the different student visa types. So there's 3 main types: Fs, Ms, and Js. Fs and Js are the 2 most common. So an F visa is for students in an academic or a language program. So if you're applying to study for 4 years at UCLA, for example, that's probably going to be on an F visa. Js are exchange visitors. So those are generally shorter term programs. So you're a PhD candidate maybe, and you're going to go work at the research lab at Berkeley for a couple of months. That might be a J. Or you might be another kind of non-degree student, for example. Those are Js. Ms are fairly uncommon. So we've seen Ms like if you want to go study a vocation in the United States. So that might be like going to pilot school, or maybe you're a musician studying piano. That would be an M visa. And I'll go into each of these categories in a little bit more detail on the next couple slides. Okay, so F and M visa overview. So these 2 visa types are pretty similar. It's just whether you're doing an academic program or a vocational program. So maybe you're attending a US high school for a year, that would be an F. You're doing a language training program, that would also be an F visa. Or like I said before, a full-time university student. And M's, like I said, fairly uncommon. That's like pilots and other vocations. Okay, so what do you actually need to have a complete F or M visa application packet? So number 1, a valid passport. That one's pretty obvious. Number 2 is that DS-160 confirmation page. So when you go online and fill out your application, that's the application confirmation page. Your MRV, or your visa fee receipt, so just the receipt showing that you've actually paid for the visa. And then probably what's one of the most important documents is the Form I-20. So that's the form that I mentioned before. It's the form that your school will send to you after you've been accepted. We have a picture of it here on the screen. And so that just shows what school you're going to, how long the program is going to be, how you're paying for your studies. That's probably, like I said, one of the most important forms when you're applying for your F or M visa. We will need your SEVIS receipt, so that's the fee that you go online and you pay. So you send us in the receipt as well, or bring it to your interview if you have to come in for an interview. We also need a photo. There's the specific requirements for the photos, or they'll tell you what it is on the website, but it's basically just a little visa photo. Evidence of ability to fund your program. So this one may or may not be required. It just, you need to have some kind of proof though of how you're going to pay for your studies. So maybe you're getting funding from CSN, maybe you're getting a scholarship, maybe your parents are paying for you. You just need some kind of documentation showing how you're going to pay for school in the United States. And then the last thing is a waybill. So when you go on PostNord and you get paid postage, so you would bring that in as well, so that once we're finished processing your application, we can mail your passport back to you. Okay, so these are the most important things to keep in mind when you're applying for an F or an M visa. So English language ability. If you're going to be studying in the United States, most of the programs are going to be in English. Financial ability. So this just goes back to how are you going to pay for your program? Are you getting a scholarship? Are you getting financial aid? Your parents are paying for it. So financial ability. Acceptance at a school, and that's evidenced by the I-20. And it has to be for a full course of study. So this is something that I haven't mentioned yet, but if you're applying for an F or an M, you're going to the United States to be a full-time student. So that doesn't mean that you can't possibly work on campus or have some kind of part-time employment, but your main job is to be a student, and that's what you should be doing with the majority of your time if you're going to be in the US on an F or M visa. And then with an F or M visa, you can enter the United States 30 days before your program starts and 60 days after the program ends. So your program dates are listed on your I-20. So you can check there to see what your entry and departure dates look like. And then just to note that we can't issue student visas more than 120 days, so 4 months before the program start date. So if your program starts, let's say September 1st, we couldn't issue the visa any sooner than 4 months before that program start date. Okay, so that's it for Fs and Ms. Now we're going to talk about Js. This is the other major category of student visas. And so it's actually pretty similar to an F or an M. So you have to be accepted to a designated exchange visitor program. You can tell that when you get your DS 2019 form in the mail. So whatever school you've applied to, they'll send you the DS 2019. Okay. Same thing as with Fs and Ms, you need to show that you have sufficient funds in order to attend school in the United States or to attend whatever program it is that you're going on your exchange for. Okay. English proficiency, again, most of the programs in the US are going to be in English. And that you possess qualifications for the program. So Js, like I said, can have a little bit more range than F and M visa applicants. So if you are a postdoc researcher doing research in New York, you probably need to be able to show that you have a bachelor's and a master's and that you're qualified to go do a postdoc in the United States, right? And then this one, compliance with 212E, if applicable. So this is something that I'm actually going to talk about in a little bit more detail on a following slide because it can get a little bit complicated. So just keep that in mind, but we'll come back to it. And then Js are a little bit different in that you can only arrive 30 days before and stay 30 days after the dates of your program. So not the 30-60 like you saw with Fs and Ms. Okay, so to talk about Js a little bit more, J visas are for any kind of exchange visitor program, but today we are only talking about what we call academic Js. So these are J visas for students, for people who are going to the US to do some kind of academic program. And there's different kinds. So we've got government visitors nominated by the US government, international visitors nominated by the State Department. So that might be Fulbright. So if you've heard of the Fulbright program, that would be an example of an international visitor nominated by the State Department. That could be professors, research scholars, short-term scholars, specialists. So I had an application recently. It was a specialist that was going to be a survival training instructor, wilderness survival training instructor in the United States. So that's an example of someone with a specialist knowledge that might be getting a J visa. And then students. So if you're going to go to high school with a host family and live in the United States for a little bit, that would also be a J visa. Okay, so the required documentation, very similar to Fs and Ms. So valid passport, again, hopefully that one is obvious. The DS-160 confirmation page, your visa fee receipt, your form DS-2019, so for Fs and Ms, it's the I-20, for Js, it's the DS-2019, your SEVIS receipt, photo, evidence of ability to pay for the program, and again, that waybill from PostNord. Okay, so what does subject to 212E actually mean? So some of the student exchange programs are funded either by the Swedish government or by the US government. So if you're a Fulbright scholar, for example, and the US is paying for your studies in the United States, you would be subject to 212E. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that you have a 2-year ban on becoming either a US long-term permanent resident or receiving an H, K, or L visa. So H's and L visas, those are employment-based visas, and K visas are for fiancés. So you would be barred from applying for any of those visas or for a long-term permanent resident status for the next 2 years if you went on a program that was sponsored by the US government or the host government. Sometimes that can be waived. It depends on the circumstances. And for many of you, it might never be an issue. You might go to the US, come back to Sweden for 2 years, and never think about it again. So it is just something to keep in mind when you apply for a J visa if it is going to be funded by either the US government or Sweden. Okay. So I can talk a little bit now about additional documentation. So these are some other situations that might come up when you're applying for a visa. So let's say that you're applying and you'd also like to take your husband and your 2 kids with you. You're going to be in the US for 4 years doing a long-term study program. So they can apply for dependent visas. So you as the principal applicant would be an F1 visa, and then your dependents would be F2s. So you can all apply together. You can all apply for visas, pay the fees, come in for the interview, or maybe get your interview waived, and they would be eligible to travel with you as long as they also qualify for the visa. So the documentation that we would need to see in that case would be like a marriage certificate if you're trying to bring a spouse, or birth certificates for the kids if you're trying to bring children. And then this next point, so if you come in for your interview or you mail us all of your application materials, we might send you or give you a letter saying that you've been refused under 221G of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And that is, it is a refusal, but it's a refusal that can be overcome if you provide us with additional information. So sometimes we just don't have enough information to make a decision on your visa application, and we need additional documentation from you. So we'll refuse your visa then, and we'll ask you for additional documentation. If you send us that documentation, we'll finish processing your case and get back to you. But it is something that can happen whether you mail in your application materials or right there at the interview window. And then just to talk a little bit more about interviews. So you might come in for an interview, and then you might have to come in for a follow-up interview. It just depends on the individual case. It depends on your application. So that is a possibility too, also with mail-in. So maybe you mail in your application, you might still have to come in for an interview anyway, depending on the circumstances. It's something that can happen, but not necessarily. Okay, so can you apply by mail instead of interviewing in person? And I've mentioned this a couple of times now. And I think that for a lot of our applicants, the answer is yes, you can apply by mail instead of coming in person. But I'm going to go through the requirements for how you can avoid having to come in for an interview. Okay, so who can skip the interview? This is the list. And let me go through everything point by point. So if you are physically present in Sweden at the time of your application, and you are either a citizen or resident. So either one, you have to just be physically present in Sweden, a citizen or resident. And you're applying for one of our student visas, so what we've been talking about, FM or Academic J. And this is the most important part. This is the part I really want to stress during this whole webinar. If you don't remember anything else, remember this part. You've traveled to the United States on ESTA, or you've had a visa before. Or if you're planning a trip to the United States before you apply for your visa. The important thing to remember is that we have changed our interview waiver requirements. They're different this year than they were the last couple of years. And so that means now that anyone who is applying for an FM or Academic J visa could be eligible for interview waiver if they have been to the United States before, either on ESTA or have had a visa before. So if those things apply to you, you could be eligible for interview waiver. And then point number 4, your last visa or ESTA application was not refused. So if you have, let's say you applied for ESTA and were refused, you wait a year, you apply again, and you're approved, you still could be eligible for interview waiver. But if you are applying for ESTA, you're refused, and then you try to apply for a student visa and the interview waiver, you wouldn't be able to do that because your most recent ESTA application was denied. The same as with a visa. So if you've come to the embassy and you apply for a tourist visa and you're denied, you're not eligible for the interview waiver in that case because your most recent visa application was denied. But if you apply for a visa and you're denied, you apply for another visa and it's approved, then your most recent visa was approved, and so then you would be eligible for interview waiver again in that case. And the same with ESTA.
When you're creating your profile for your appointment system, those questions will be asked when you're creating your profile. So there will be questions reflecting if you hold an ESTA, have ever had a visa before, if you've been refused a visa or ESTA. If the system determines that you qualify for the interview waiver, you will eventually end up with an interview confirmation letter. This is what I mentioned before. You need to have the confirmation letter before you mail anything in to us. Until you haven't received your confirmation letter, do not just send in your documents. So answer all the questions and see if you qualify.
Yeah, so that's this last bit here on the slide. Go through the visa appointment website and answer the questions. So we have it's really straightforward on the website. There will be a list of questions. You answer them. It's a wizard. It takes you right through, and then it tells you whether you're eligible to mail in or not. So don't worry about memorizing everything on this slide. But when you go on the website to apply, it'll take you through the steps. But I want to reiterate again how important this point number 3 is, having traveled to the United States on ESTA or having had a prior visa before. So those of you might remember the last couple of years, due to COVID, due to staffing challenges, we've had extremely limited appointment availability at the embassy here in Stockholm. And we foresee that that will still be a challenge this summer, that we're still going to have extremely limited interview capacity at the embassy. So your best chance at having your visa in hand so that you can go to your academic program on time in the fall is to be able to do an interview waiver, is to not have to schedule an interview, skip that whole thing, mail us your application. It saves us time, it saves you time, and it's the best way to have your visa on time so that you can make it to your academic program. Last year, we had the benefit of some friendly embassies in the neighborhood, so so we were able to send applicants over to Germany, over to Poland, and they were able to get interviews there in order to get their visas on time. But given the conditions in Europe currently, we don't foresee that being a solution this summer. So I just want to stress again that the interview waiver requirements have changed, that now if you've been to the United States on ESTA or you've had a visa before, you are eligible to mail in, you're likely eligible to mail in your materials to us. So if you were thinking of going to visit your school, it's April. If you want to plan a trip in May or June, travel to the United States, visit your school, and then come back, apply for your student visa, you would then be eligible for the interview waiver. So let me just say one more time how important it is that you do what you can to avoid having to schedule an interview. We're not going to have a lot of appointments. It's better for you, it's better for us if you can get the interview waived. Okay? So with that said, I'm going to go through who cannot skip the interview. Okay, so it's basically the opposite of what was on the previous slide. So if you're not a citizen of Sweden, if you're not a resident of Sweden, if you're not living here, you can't skip the interview. So if you're from Jamaica, you're in Sweden for the summer, you're not a resident, you don't live here, you can't skip the interview. Non-academic Js. So I talked about the different J categories. So there are some Js that cannot skip the interview. And so those are our non-academic Js. So if you're an au pair, if you're an intern, if you're a camp counselor, you can't skip the interview. The interview waiver requirements, they don't apply to you. So you are not able to skip the interview. And you'll know that on your DS 2019. So if your DS 2019 says au pair on it, you have to come in for an interview. If it says research scholar, student scholar, short-term scholar, anything like that, then you're an academic J, and you may be eligible for the interview waiver. So I'm going to say this again. So if you've never traveled to the United States before, or your last ESTA or visa application was refused, you're not eligible for the interview waiver program. So if you think that you would otherwise be eligible to have the interview waived, but the only thing holding you back is that you've never traveled to the United States before, you want to seriously consider going and visiting that school. Take the time to go visit the school that you'd like to attend, and then you'll be eligible for the interview waiver. So, okay, those are the people that cannot skip the interview. Okay, so how do you actually mail in your application, and how is it different from coming in for an interview? So it's the exact same documents that you would bring into an interview: valid passport, DS-160, all the other documents, plus proof of travel to the United States. So how do you show proof of travel to the United States? You can have an old passport with stamps in it. If your current passport has stamps in it, that's even better. You're going to mail us that anyway. So if that's got stamps in it, perfect. Or the third option is what's called the I-94. So this is a form that you can get from DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. You can go, if you Google DHS I-94, the website will come up. You can put in your information on the website, and it'll give you your travel history to the United States. So it'll show your entries and exits. So that's another way to, you can print that out, mail it to us with your application. That's another way to show proof of travel to the United States. So it's really easy. It's the same exact documents that you'd need to bring to an interview anyway, just plus proof of US travel. Okay, so I'm going to talk very briefly just about the US COVID travel rules right now. They're probably going to change for those of you that are traveling to the US in the fall for your academic programs, but as of right now, you need to be vaccinated and you need to have a test done within 24 hours of departure. And then CDC might have other requirements. So the best advice really is to just go to the CDC website before you're going to travel and confirm what the restrictions are at the time that you're planning to travel. Okay, so This is pretty much the last slide because we don't want to take up too much more time. We'd like to get to your questions. I'm sure everybody has a lot. So best practices. Like I said before, apply early. It might take longer than you think. So just get us all of your application materials as soon as you have everything together so you'll have your visa ready to go for your academic program. Okay? One more time, travel to the United States. So travel to the United States is what's going to guarantee, or it's what's going to give you the possibility to waive your interview. Okay? We're going to have extremely limited interview capacity over the summer. So your best bet for having your visa in hand and making it to your program on time is to be able to apply for the interview waiver. And the main requirement for that is having traveled to the US on ESTA before, having had a visa before. Okay. Best practice number 3. So follow the instructions on the website. Our website, I think our website is fairly clear. It's step-by-step, tells you exactly what you need. Again, we somehow still get applications that are incomplete or don't have the documents that we need. So just go through slowly, read all the steps, read all the instructions, make sure you're sending us a complete application package. And finally, just use your visa as intended. So you're going to the United States to study, you're going to be there as a student. That is your purpose of travel, so just make sure that that's what you're doing when you're in the United States. Okay, so this is the last slide before I turn it over to Beatrice, who's going to start asking us the questions. So these are the websites that you need to know about in order to apply for a student visa. So number 1, self-explanatory, to apply for a visa, go to that website. For complete information on student visas, it's the next one, and you can, under that is the SEVIS link. And then finally, if you have questions, so we're going to try to answer as many general questions as we can at the end of this presentation. I think we've got about half an hour left. But if you have specific questions, if you've got some kind of unique situation that you need an answer for, you can go to that, you can send inquiries to that last one there or phone that number and they can help you with your specific questions. Otherwise, I think that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and let Beatrice ask us the questions.
Okay, so we've had a lot of participants who are asking questions relating to passports. And our first question is, if I do not qualify for an interview waiver and need to book a visa interview at the embassy, does my passport need to be valid for at least another 6 months, which is the case for the interview waiver process?
In general, when traveling to the US, the passport should be valid for additional 6 months beyond the stay in the United States. The US have certain agreements with some countries where the passport is extended for additional 6 months, which basically means that as long as the passport is covering the full program, it can be used for travel to that program. But we always encourage all applicants to have passports that have a long validity. There are possibilities to extend your stay in the States, then you should have a longer passport. The main thing is that your passport always must be valid when you are in the United States.
Okay, we also have a couple of questions regarding the long waiting times for renewing your Swedish passports. If my passport expires before my interview at the embassy, what do I do? Can I apply for the visa with one passport and then leave the US with my renewed passport?
Well, when you submit your application, you can of course use the passport data you have in your passport in your hand. You may of course apply for a visa at any time, but if the passport is not sufficient to cover that stay in the US, we will be unable to issue a visa to that passport and will request you to renew your passport. If a visa have been issued into a passport that will expire during your stay in the United States, or the visa validity is longer than the passport, you can still use a valid visa when traveling together with a new passport. Again, it's so important that you always need to carry a valid passport when traveling to the United States. But a valid visa that's issued into an old passport can still be used within its validity dates when traveling together with a new passport and your school documents like the I-24 F&M visas or the DS-2019 4J visas.
We also have a lot of questions regarding extending your stay after the visa expires. People are wondering if you are able to stay, for example, 90 days after you have finished your studies.
When you are traveling on one of the school programs, there are certain limits that you need to be aware about. Ollie mentioned about is 60 days for F visas, 30 days for J visas. That's the permitted period of stay when you're traveling on F, J, or M visas. You cannot stay another 90 days. You would have to leave the United States within that permitted dates you have on your documents from your school. So 90 days would not be permitted. It's 60 days for a completed program on F visa and 30 days for a completed J or M visa.
Also related to that question, some participants are wondering if you can extend your visa while you're in the United States, or do you have to leave the United States?
A US visa can only be issued by a US embassy or consulate abroad. So a visa cannot be renewed while being in the United States. Though the visa is not a document showing how long you can actually stay. Your length of stay is determined by the Department of Homeland Security when you enter it, and it's usually based on your SEVIS record, which is, as I previously mentioned, 30 or 60 days. So as long as you are in an active student status, you may remain in the United States. For example, if you enter to the United States on a J program and then find a new program that you extend and your SEVIS data is updated with the new program dates, you may remain in the United States as long as your student status is active.
We also have some participants wondering if they are able to work on a student visa and what jobs they can undertake while they are in the United States.
As an F1 student, you may accept some on-campus employment, which means that these are jobs offered at campus. It could be the local cafeteria. All those on-campus employment must be approved by your designated school officials, and you need an approval from your school. After 1 year of studies, you could actually apply for an off-campus employment. You would need a special permit from the US Department of Homeland Security, which allows you to work outside campus. And again, you would need approval from your designated school official. Sometimes some programs also have a curricular where you can work within the field of your studies. Those are called CPT or OPT, either during your program or OPT once you have completed your program. That's also something I would advise you to contact your designated school official for more information about.
And I'll also add too that just remember that you're in the U.S. to be a full-time student unless you're doing OPT, for example. But generally on an FM or J visa, you're a full-time student. So you could, even with the on-campus job or an off-campus job, if you can get one, those could still only be part-time. You can only work, I think, 20 hours a week. So it still could only be a part-time job. You can't have a full-time job and also be working, or also have an FM or J visa. So just remember that.
We also have one participant wondering here, if my visa is valid for a year, am I allowed to travel home over Christmas, or do I need to stay in the US during the whole period?
So as long as your visa is valid, you can travel in and out of the United States. So if you get the visa in July and it's good for a year, then yeah, you could definitely travel home for Christmas and then come back.
We also have quite a lot of questions about eligibility for an interview waiver. We have one participant wondering, if I apply for an ESTA and don't travel to the US, am I still eligible for an interview waiver?
You actually need to travel. When you use the option of traveling or be eligible for a waiver because of an ESTA, you need to travel to the US before you can meet the eligibility for interview waiver.
Yeah, so it's not enough to just apply for and receive ESTA. You need to actually travel to the United States.
We also have a couple of participants wondering if the ESTA still has to be valid in order for one to skip the interview at the embassy. What happens if you haven't kept your ESTA documents, and does it have to be an ESTA that is related to your current passport?
So no, your ESTA does not have to be currently valid in order for you to qualify for an interview waiver, and it doesn't have to be connected to your current passport either. So if you traveled on ESTA 10 years ago and you've still got the old passport like that you entered on with the stamps in it, that would be fine. Like I said, that I-94 record that you can get online, that'll show as long as you've got the previous passport number and you use the name that you were using at the time of the passport. You put that information in, it'll bring up those travel records. You can print those out and mail them to us, and that's good enough too. So it doesn't have to be a valid ESTA, and it doesn't have to be the same passport number with which you traveled on ESTA either.
We also have a couple of practical questions. One participant writes, you mentioned that you should apply as early as possible, but that you cannot issue the visa earlier than 120 days before the program start date. If applying by postal mail, should you hold off on sending the required application documents until within the 120-day mark? If scheduling an interview at the embassy, should you then schedule the visa interview for a date that is within the 120 days?
When using the option of mailing in your application, you should wait within that 120-day window. When it comes to interview, under current circumstances, you should apply as early as possible. Just because we can't issue the visa doesn't mean that we cannot take your interview if you do not qualify for an interview waiver. So try to do it as quickly as possible. But for everyone's convenience, if you're a mail-in applicant, please wait until that 120-day window, 4 months window.
We also have a couple of questions regarding COVID. How many doses is required to enter the US, and what kind of COVID test is required when you arrive to the US?
I would have to refer to the CDC website. They have specific instructions with requirements for COVID testing, the vaccine, and possible waivers for travel. So this is not part of the visa process. Please visit the cdc.gov website.
We also have a couple of questions regarding the handling time for the visa application process. What can applicants expect when they are mailing in their applications, and how long can they expect it to take if they are booking an interview at the embassy? Is it enough time to apply now if you are going to the US to study during the fall semester?
So yes, it would be enough time if you're applying to study in the US in the fall. So right now I can tell you about our processing time. So we do actually have interviews available now, fairly soon. And the time frame for that is that you would book the appointment, you come in for your interview. You're generally going to get a decision right there at the window, provided we have all of your documentation. And then after that, it's a week. If you're approved, it takes about a week for us to print the visa, put it in your passport, and get it back to you in the mail. So you'll have it about a week after your interview. As for mail-in, so generally those we get the mail, we can process those applications within a couple of days of receiving them in the mail. We get the visa printed the next couple of days after that, and then again, it's a week after that. So with the mail-in, I'd say you're looking around 2 to 3 weeks maybe. And then with the interview, it's about a week after the day of your interview.
So even though most visas are processed within 1 to, when we reach to the summer, it may take up to 3 weeks. But due to individual circumstances, some cases might take longer. Or if we're missing any documents in order for us to complete your application, that's going to add the extra time for completion of the full visa process.
And that's a good point too. So that's our processing time right now. So as you can imagine, we get more student applications over the summer. So it might take a little bit longer to process the applications then. And this is a good time to reiterate that we're not going to have a lot of appointment slots available. There's not going to be a lot of interview slots. So it might take a little bit longer with your mail-in application, but then you're not waiting on an interview. You're not trying to book a time. It's better if you can mail in your application.
We also have a couple of people who are wondering if you're able to travel to neighboring countries in order to get your visa application handled faster, or do you have to live in the same country that you are applying from?
By law, you may apply for a visa at any U.S. embassy or consulate you wish. Though you must remember that most visa categories have certain requirements where the consular officer needs to see your ties to the country of residence or citizenship, which may be sometimes difficult when you're applying through a different post. It is strongly advised to apply where you hold your residence or your citizenship. That does not mean that you cannot apply anywhere else, but we strongly recommend that you first apply in your country of citizenship or residency.
And just to reiterate, as far as the interview waiver process, you do have to be a citizen or a resident of Sweden, and you do have to be physically present here in order to have the interview waived. So keep that in mind at the beginning of the interview waiver process as well.
We also have one question regarding how long it takes before you get your documentation back after you have mailed in your application.
Most relevant documents are usually returned together with a passport. When you're in for an interview, you will bring a lot of documents, and most likely, most documents will be returned at the time of your interview. We will keep your passport and your waiver for processing, and we will return your passport once the visa process is completed. For mail-ins, we will return all relevant documents, which is your passport, your I-20 or DS-2019. If you have other copies, for example, proof of funding from CSN letter, those documents are usually destroyed after the visa interview. To simply skip, these are documents that we do not find are difficult to obtain again, and we consider them as copies.
We also have a couple of participants who are wondering if they can book a visa appointment now, or do they have to wait for an acceptance letter from their universities or the high schools that will be hosting them.
In order to schedule your interview or have your eligibility for a mail-in, you first need to receive your documents from school in order to submit your electronic DS-160 application form. Once you have obtained your forms from school, make sure to submit your application form. Then you can proceed to the appointment website where you're going to place your payment for your visa and schedule your interview or receive the information about the waiver.
So that goes back to that chart I showed towards the beginning of the presentation. And if you'll remember, step one was you get your DS-2019 or your I-20 in the mail. So that's the starting point for applying for your visa. So you have to have those documents in hand first before you can start the visa process.
We have a lot of people who are still wondering about the application time and how long it takes in order to get your application processed. We have a couple of questions regarding if you can do the interview at a different embassy than the one you are applying to. Yeah.
When you go to your appointment system, you need to go to the appointment system of the embassy where you intend to apply. Your DS-160 application form, the visa application form, needs also to be submitted for that embassy where you intend to apply. So if you submit your application for Stockholm, if you go to the appointment website for Stockholm, you will need to present your visa application to Stockholm. If you wish to apply at a different US embassy or consulate, you will need to submit a new application form and also proceed with the appointment site from that embassy.
Yeah, so yeah, you basically the embassy to which you're applying is the embassy to which you would do your interview with, or would be the embassy where you mail your stuff to. You can't like mix and match, I suppose.
We also have one person wondering if I'm not eligible for an interview waiver and I need to leave soon. Is there any other way that I can get my visa if I can't get an interview appointment before I have to leave?
If you're not qualified for an interview waiver, you need to schedule an appointment. If for any reason there are no appointments in the near future, you have the option of making an emergency request. You can only make an emergency request once you hold a regular appointment in the appointment system. All emergency requests are individually reviewed by the consular staff, And if you have justification that shows that you are a true emergency, we will be able to offer you an earlier appointment. Please remember that we have very limited availability for regular appointments. We also have very limited availability for the emergency appointments. So in order to meet the qualification for an emergency appointment, it really needs to be a highly justified emergency.
Yes, there's a very high bar for emergency appointments, and just because you're running out of time before your academic program starts does not qualify as an emergency.
Related to that, we also have a participant wondering if you are able to have the visa interview online.
No, unfortunately, we do not offer online visa interviews. We are still very old school. You have to come to the embassy and do your interview in person.
Yeah, a part of the visa application is that we also collect your fingerprints, and we cannot simply take in fingerprints online.
That would be cool, but we cannot do that.
Yeah.
We also have one question here. If I travel to the US 3 weeks before my program starts just to visit, will I need 2 different visas? I will be in the same state but study in a different city than the one I will visit.
This raises a very good question, because when you are intending to travel as a student, you must enter the United States using the student visa, J visa or F visa or M visa, to be able to actually go and study. If you want to travel to the US before, let's say before 30 days, or if you just want to visit in order to be eligible for interview waiver, and you do not have a J, F, or M visa yet, you would have to travel on ESTA or a regular visitor visa, and you would need to depart the US in order to obtain or travel on your student visa. So you cannot travel to the US on ESTA and continue later on with your studies without departing, or you cannot enter the US on a regular visitor visa and proceed with your studies. You need to leave and request admission to the United States again using your student visa.
Okay, we've covered most of the general questions, so I'm going to move into some more specific ones. We have one question. We are Swedish citizens but live in a different country. What embassy do we apply to?
You may, of course, apply in the country of your residency. If you're not living in Sweden, you may apply where you currently reside if you have a residency that you can prove to the consular officer that you have ties to that country. And you're, of course, welcome to apply in your country of citizenship. If you're a Swedish citizen, you're, of course, welcome to apply here in Stockholm.
We also have one participant wondering, I am planning to studying a 6-week course in the US and I want to bring my 12-year-old daughter. Does my daughter also need a visa or will an ESTA suffice?
In this case, so you might remember from the slides that we did talk about dependent visas. So if you'd like to bring your daughter with you while you're studying in the United States, you could apply for a dependent visa for her as well. So if it's an F, C, or J, whichever one it was, you'd be the principal applicant and your daughter would be the dependent applicant. And you can apply for both at the same time. And then if you qualify, then she could get a visa to go with you. And really the only documentation you would have to show in that case is probably your personbevis, just showing the parental relationship between you and the child.
And the child would also need her own DS 2019 or I-20.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so she would also have to have the same document. So it's 2 separate visa applications. So everything that you would have to submit for yourself, you would also have to submit for your child.
Something I just also want to mention, this is when an immediate relative is joining the principal applicant to go to the United States. If you're a student, want to bring your spouse or child, the spouse or child need a derivative visa, which basically means a visa within the same category, but a derivative class to your. If you are a student in the United States, and let's say your parent wants to visit you temporarily because you're a student, that would be something else. But anyone who joins you as the principal applicant and is an immediate family member must have a derivative visa or visa within the same visa category.
Yeah, so if you're a student and you're living in the United States and your mom wants to come visit you for the weekend, and she can travel on ESTA, she can travel on ESTA in that case. It's just if somebody's going to be going with you to live with you in the United States, essentially, that you would need the derivative visa.
Another more specific question. I have a B1, B2 visa with an expiration date in 2028, and I'm going to study in the United States. Do I still need a student visa, or can I travel on my B1 visa?
I've answered this previously, but no, you cannot study on your B1, B2 visa. B1, B2 visa is only for temporary visits for business or pleasure. It's not for travel to attend an institution in the United States. You need to request admission to the United States using a student visa for the purpose why it was issued. So if you're a student, F student needs an F visa, J student needs a J visa, and the student needs an M visa. You cannot request entry under B1, B2 visa.
All right, I think we have gone through most of the questions here. We have a couple of more specific questions regarding the emergency visa. Is an exchange student starting the program in August who has not received an interview by mid-July eligible for an emergency request?
No. That's not an emergency. If you can't get an interview in time to start your academic program, that's not something that you can get an emergency appointment for. If that's all the questions, do we have any last minutes?
We have one last question. I think you might have answered this before. But again, it's how long after your studies end do you have to leave the US? Can you still apply for a visa in the US?
We answered this previously, but I'm happy to say it again that you cannot apply for a visa while being in the United States. The visa is only entry documents needed to request admission to the United States. Therefore, a visa can only be applied at the US Embassy or consulate abroad. If you're in the United States, your length of stay is determined on your student status. So if you're F or J or M students, your documents will say when your program ends. F students will be able to remain 60 days beyond their end date, program end date. F and M students are allowed to stay additional 30 days after the program end date. It's also very important to remember, if you decide to quit your studies, you will be needed to leave the United States immediately. So if you do not follow through with your studies, if you skip school, you will be required to leave immediately since your status will be terminated.
It sounds like that might be the end of the questions that we've got. So if that's the case,
Yeah.
I might go ahead and wrap up things here. Okay. So this concludes our presentation on student and exchange visitor visas. I hope that you have found this helpful. So we have recorded this presentation and it will be available online afterwards. I'd just like to conclude by saying thank you so much for attending. And I want to reiterate the number one point that we wanted to get across with this webinar is that appointments are limited. If you want to study in the United States, your best bet is to be eligible for the interview waiver. So just remember that to qualify for that, resident or citizen of Sweden, you have to be applying for an FM or academic J. And then most important, traveled to the US before on ESTA or had a prior visa. Okay, so you want to have your visa in time for your studies, try to skip the interview, make sure you qualify for the interview waiver. Thank you once again, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Adam, for helping me answer the questions and give the presentation. And I will turn it back over to Martin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Holly and Adam, for a great presentation. And thank you, Holly, Adam, Beatrice, and of course, all of the participants for a valuable and very informative Q&A session. So I know we're approaching the end of the hour, but before letting you all go this afternoon, I wanted, of course, to give you all a very big thank you for taking the time to join us for this webinar. And just as Holly mentioned, we have recorded our presentation today, so we will make it available to you next week, just to make sure that you don't miss out on any important details, and of course, so that you can pass it on to your friends and family who couldn't make it today. So with that said, thank you for joining us once again, and have a fantastic weekend.